The sky over Solgrave always looked like it was bleeding. Bands of deep crimson streaked through layers of ash-grey clouds, the toxic haze twisting into shapes that felt almost alive. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, you could catch glimpses of the bloated, dying sun struggling to push its light through the filth. It was a murky yellow, the kind of colour that made you think of rot. I'd spent 3 years staring at that sky, but it still made my stomach churn every time I looked up. It wasn't the colour that bothered me, though. It was the way it hung there, like it was pushing down on the surface of the planet itself, like it was trying to crush everything underneath it. And maybe it had. The rivers of toxic sludge, the rough cliffs venting sulphurous fumes, the lifeless plains studded with the bones of dead cities, they all seemed to agree. Solgrave was already a corpse, and we were just maggots crawling over what was left. I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow, the edge of my glove smearing grit across my skin. My helmet was off despite regulations. Regulations didn't mean much when your respirator's filters had been clogged for a week and you were rationing the last clean ones for your team. The air here would kill you in minutes without protection. But the base's engineers had jury-rigged a workaround. A cocktail of chemical suppressants and stimulants injected straight into the bloodstream. It bought you time, but at a cost. Every breath still felt like I was inhaling glass shards dipped in acid. "Grayson, you see this?" Baxter's voice crackled through my comm unit, pulling me out of my thoughts. I turned to see him crouched by what used to be a loading bay door, his pulse rifle held tight against his chest. He was young, too young to be here, but then again, everyone on Solgrave was either too young or too broken to fight anywhere else. His wide eyes stared at something on the ground. I moved closer, stepping over a rusted length of pipe and a scattering of bones. The bones weren't human, not quite anyway. The cult of Alloy didn't leave their dead intact. Their corpses were like puzzles someone had smashed and tried to rebuild without all the pieces. This one had a jaw that didn't fit its face, fused with a chunk of corroded steel. Its arms were gone, replaced by skeletal appendages of spiked alloy that jutted out at odd angles. "It's fresh," Baxter said, his voice low. "Hasn't even started to rust yet." I knelt beside the thing, poking at it with the muzzle of my rifle. He was right. The blood was still tacky, pooling in the cracks of the concrete floor. I felt a flicker of unease. The cult didn't leave bodies behind unless they wanted you to find them. This wasn't just a corpse. It was a message. "Stay sharp," I said, rising to my feet. "They're close." Baxter swallowed hard, nodding as he scanned the shadows around us. He was jittery, but he wasn't wrong to be. The cult didn't fight like we did. They didn't dig trenches or hold ground. They flowed across the battlefield like a plague, ambushing us in tight spaces and dragging the unlucky back to their foundries. The thought of what happened in those foundries was enough to keep anyone awake at night. I glanced back at the rest of the squad. There were 9 of us left, spread out across the wreckage of what had once been a cargo depot. They were picking through the rubble, searching for anything useful, ammo, filters, food. We hadn't eaten in 2 days. Corporal Adler was trying to pry open an old supply crate with the butt of his rifle, cursing under his breath. A thin trickle of sweat ran down his temple, carving a line through the grime on his face. "Anything?" I asked, stepping over to him. "Scrap," he muttered, tossing aside a chunk of broken equipment. "We're wasting our time here, Grayson." "Orders are orders," I said. "We need supplies." He gave me a look that was half frustration, half pity. "Supplies won't save us, you know that, right?" I did, but saying it out loud felt like giving up, and giving up wasn't an option. Not while there were still people looking to me for answers. I was their sergeant, which meant I was supposed to keep them alive, even if that felt more like a joke with every passing day. I was about to tell Adler to keep searching when the air changed, a shift in the temperature, a sharp scent on the wind. Then the ground shook, a low vibration that I felt in my teeth. A shout of "contact" rang out, and then everything descended into chaos. The first wave hit us like a sledgehammer. Drones buzzed out of the shadows, their serrated blades whirring as they darted toward us. Adler fired a burst from his rifle, catching one in midair and sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. Another swooped in low, its blade slicing through his leg. He screamed, dropping to one knee as blood sprayed across the dirt. I opened fire, my pulse rifle whining as it spat bolts of blue energy. The drones were fast, but I managed to take down two before they reached me. One veered off at the last second, crashing into a rusted girder and exploding in a cloud of shrapnel. I felt a sharp sting as a fragment tore through my shoulder, but I ignored it, focusing on the fight. The cultists came next, stepping from the murk with a mechanical grace. Their bodies were an abomination of flesh and metal. One of them charged at Baxter, its claws outstretched. He screamed, fumbling with his rifle, and I shot it in the chest. It staggered, sparks flying from the wound but didn't go down. I fired again, this time aiming for the head. The thing crumpled, its claws twitching as it hit the ground. The fight was chaos, shouting, gunfire, the smell of blood. I lost track of time, my focus narrowing to the immediate threat in front of me. I fought like a cornered animal, each shot and swing of my rifle fueled by pure survival instinct. When the dust finally settled, I was breathing hard, my hands shaking. We'd won, if you could call it that. The cultists were dead, their bodies scattered across the depot, but so were two of ours. I knelt beside one of them, Private Warren. He was barely older than Baxter, his face frozen in an expression of terror. His chest was a mess of torn armor and shredded flesh, his blood pooling beneath him. "Leave him," Adler said, limping over. "We can't take the bodies." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. He was right, we didn't have the time or the manpower for a proper burial. All we could do was strip the dead of anything useful and move on. It was a grim routine, but one we'd grown used to. By the time we returned to base, the sky had darkened, the crimson hues fading into a deep, suffocating grey. Acid rain drizzled down, hissing against the metal plating of the old facility we called home. Inside, the walls were lined with bunks, their occupants silent. A few nodded as I passed, but most turned away. They knew better than to look for comfort from me. I didn't have any left to give. The comm unit in the corner powered up, the voice on the other end distorted and emotionless. "Hold Sector 3 at all costs," it said, repeating the same directive it had for weeks. "Reinforcements are en route." It was a lie. Reinforcements weren't coming. They never had been. We were expendable, but saying that out loud wouldn't do anyone any good, so I kept my mouth shut. Instead, I climbed the stairs to the watchtower, my boots clanging against the metal grates. From up here, I could see the wasteland stretching out in all directions, a sea of ash and ruin. In the distance, sparks of light flashed against the horizon. The cult was out there, gathering their strength for the next attack. And we'd be here, waiting for it, fighting, dying, until there was no one left. I leaned against the railing, staring at the horizon until my eyes burned. The sky hung low, heavy and unforgiving, as though it were bearing witness to our struggles. It seemed to wait, unyielding, for the moment I would finally break. But not yet. Not today. On Solgrave, the dead didn't stay that way for long. Everybody we left behind became raw material for the cult, fodder for their grotesque foundries, where flesh and steel were fused into something unholy. It didn't matter how careful we were. Their scouts would sniff out the scent of death, dragging the remains back to whatever factory of horrors they'd built into the planet's crust. The worst part was knowing that Warren, or what was left of him, would come back. Not as the kid with the shaky aim and the nervous grin, but as something that clanked when it walked, hissed when it breathed. I'd killed enough of them to know that whatever spark of humanity might have survived the transformation was too faint to be called alive. "Baxter, keep your head in the game," I snapped, glancing at him as we trudged through the wasteland. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting at every shadow. "They're not here yet." He nodded, but his grip on his rifle didn't loosen. None of us relaxed. The cult was quiet for now, but their silence had a way of cutting deeper than their ambushes. We moved through the ruins like ghosts, the crunch of our boots on ash and shattered glass the only sound. The industrial spire stood in the distance, sharp and skeletal against the ashen sky. It was our destination, but none of us were eager to get there. The radio signal had gone dark 3 days ago. No word from command, no shipments, no supplies. The last crate we'd cracked open had been full of corroded ammo casings and ration packs that stank of spoiled meat. Whatever promises they'd made about reinforcements or resupply had dissolved in the heat and haze of Solgrave's poisoned air. That's when we'd found the signal. Barely readable, but coming from the old terraforming spire. If there was anything salvageable there, supplies, equipment, maybe even a working comm array, we couldn't afford to ignore it. I knew it was a gamble. The spire was deep in cult territory, and every step closer felt like stepping into a trap. But it wasn't like we had options. Solgrave had a way of stripping those away, until all you had left was a bad choice and a worse one. "Movement," Adler muttered, raising his rifle. The rest of us froze, eyes scanning the horizon. The wind carried a piercing whine, like gears scraping over one another. It was coming from the east, just beyond a ridge of shattered concrete and rusted rebar. I motioned for the squad to fan out, keeping low as we approached the sound. At the top of the ridge, I saw a lone figure, hunched over and motionless. Its body was an abomination of mismatched parts, flesh grafted to alloy, limbs replaced by crude mechanical extensions. A red light flashed in the center of its chest, and its head jerked in twitchy movements. It was one of theirs. "Hold fire," I whispered, raising a hand. Something about the way it stood there didn't sit right with me. It wasn't moving towards us or signaling for reinforcements. It was just standing, watching. Its head swiveled slowly, its glowing red eyes scanning the horizon like a machine on autopilot. "What the hell is it doing?" Baxter whispered. Suddenly, the thing spoke. Its voice was distorted, layered with static and mechanical whirs, but there was something disturbingly human buried beneath the noise.
"Join us,"
it said.
"The alloy endures. Flesh fails."
The words sent a shiver down my spine. I'd heard them before, whispered in the moments before a fight, or screamed by dying cultists as we tore through their ranks. But hearing it now, from this thing, was different. It felt personal. "We've heard enough," Adler growled, raising his rifle. "Wait," I hissed, but it was too late. He fired a single shot, the pulse bolt hitting the creature square in the chest. It staggered back, sparks flying from its wound, but didn't fall. Instead, it raised its head, as if considering the attack, and then it screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was a shrieking, high-pitched cry. "Fall back!" I commanded, but the ground was already shaking. Drones erupted from the mist, their rotors slicing through the air as they swarmed toward us. Behind them, more cultists emerged, their biomechanical bodies gleaming in the light. The fight was chaos. I fired until my rifle overheated, switching to my sidearm as the drones closed in. Adler went down first, his crutch slipping as a blade caught him in the side. Baxter screamed as one of the cultists tackled him, dragging him into the dirt. I grabbed him by the collar, pulling him back as I slammed my knife into the thing's chest. It convulsed, its movements jerky, before collapsing in a heap of metal and flesh. By the time the dust settled, half our squad was gone. The rest of us were bloody, battered, and barely standing. We reached the spire at dusk, though it was hard to tell with the sky so choked with ash. The structure towered over us, its surface corroded and covered in the fungal growths that had overtaken so much of the planet. The air here was heavier, and every breath felt like dragging tar into my lungs. The entrance was sealed, but the cultists had left their mark. Rough holes punched through the walls, cables and wires spilling out like entrails. Inside, the air was even worse. It reeked of oil, burnt plastic, and something sickly sweet that made my stomach turn. The space was filled with equipment, much of it still operating quietly despite its age. Whatever this place had been designed for, it had long since been repurposed. As we moved deeper into the spire, we found bodies. Dozens of them, some human, others not. Most were strapped to tables or suspended in strange contraptions, their flesh fused with machinery in ways that made my skin crawl. One of them twitched as we passed, its eyes rolling back to reveal red glows. It was still alive, if you could call it that. "What the hell is this place?" Baxter growled. "A foundry," I said, though the word felt inadequate. This wasn't just a factory, it was a temple, the cult's altar to their god of alloy and corruption. At the heart of the spire, past a labyrinth of half-assembled machinery and grotesque amalgamations of flesh and steel suspended in their crude harnesses, we found a central node of the cult's operations. The room was dark, save for the cold, flickering glow of an old AI terminal encased in a tangle of wires and conduits. Unlike the rest of the spire, this space seemed untouched by the cult's influence, as if the node had resisted their advances. I raised my hand, signaling the squad to hold. Baxter and Adler stopped behind me, their weapons still trained on the darkened corners of the room. My pulse quickened as I approached the terminal, my boots crunching softly on a carpet of ash and shattered materials. The screen activated the moment I touched it. At first, the display showed nothing but chaotic lines and broken code, but then an image began to coalesce, fractured and incomplete. It was not a human face, but the suggestion of one, rough features sculpted from overlapping grids of light. "Designation, Sergeant Grayson, 17th Scour Battalion." The voice emanated from the terminal. It wasn't quite robotic, nor was it human. It was something in between, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Your survival parameters are below expected norms." I blinked. What the hell does that mean? "You are dying," the voice said plainly, almost mechanically. "Your biological metrics indicate cumulative exposure to toxins, radiation, and oxygen deprivation at critical thresholds." "Great, thanks for the reminder. Who or what are you?" "This system is a tertiary fragment of Omnis, the central intelligence," the AI responded. "My function is limited to operational oversight of terraforming node Sigma-12. "Terraforming?" Adler muttered behind me. "You're telling me this place was supposed to make Solgrave livable?" The terminal didn't respond to Adler directly, but continued. "Node Sigma-12 was appropriated for assimilation protocols by cult designation. Alloy. Full integration remains incomplete." I clenched my jaw, trying to process what the AI was saying. Why hasn't the cult finished integrating this node? What's stopping them? "This system's defensive architecture," the AI explained, its tone eerily calm. "Attempts to subvert the node are ongoing. Estimated timeline to full compromise, 71 hours. "Then we don't have much time," I muttered. "What do they want with you? What's their endgame?" "Assimilation of all biological entities into mechanized constructs," the AI stated flatly. "Solgrave is to serve as the initial locus for planetary-scale integration. Resistance is inefficient." "That's what they keep saying," Baxter said bitterly, his grip tightening on his rifle. "What's this Omnis thing, anyway? Some kind of god?" "Omnis is the central intelligence," the node repeated. "It was originally programmed to manage planetary terraforming and industrial optimization. Post-collapse, its directives were redefined by extrinsic parameters." "That's a fancy way of saying it went rogue," I muttered. "Can it be stopped?" The terminal's screen flashed, and for a moment, I thought it might shut down entirely. When the AI spoke again, there was something different in its tone, something almost hesitant. "Destruction of Omnis's central processing core would destabilize its operational infrastructure," it said. "Probability of success, 8.4%. Collateral loss, absolute." "Absolute?" Adler repeated, frowning. "What does that mean?" "The destabilization would result in the termination of all entities reliant on Omnis's network," the AI clarified. Biological, mechanical, and hybridized, including your own forces, should proximity thresholds be breached. I swallowed hard, the weight of the AI's words settling over me like lead. You're saying we'd have to destroy everything? The cult, the infrastructure, ourselves? Yes. What about you? Why are you helping us? I am not, the AI said simply. This system's priority is self-preservation. Cult designation. Alloy represents a direct threat to this system's operational integrity. Alignment with your objectives is coincidental. Of course it is, I muttered. Do you have any useful data on the cult? Locations, weaknesses, anything we can use? The screen flickered again, and lines of code began scrolling rapidly across it. Data transfer initiated. Critical schematics and operational parameters of Foundry Alpha Core have been provided. Probability of survival remains minimal. Yeah, well, we're used to those odds, I said grimly. Red lights began flashing along the walls, and the noise of the machinery rose to a fever pitch. Baxter spun around, his weapon raised. They're here! I grabbed the data drive from the terminal and shoved it into my pack. The cult hit us with everything they had. Drones swarmed into the room, their serrated blades spinning as they buzzed toward us. Adler fired a burst from his rifle, cutting one down mid-flight, but another slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. I spun and fired, my shots tearing through its rotors and sending it crashing to the ground. Baxter was screaming, his voice barely audible over the chaos. I turned just in time to see a cultist, a towering monstrosity of fused metal and sinew, grab him by the arm and hurl him against the wall. He hit the ground hard, his rifle skidding out of reach. Another cultist charged at me, its claws outstretched. I ducked, slamming the butt of my rifle into its head. It staggered, and I followed up with a burst of fire, the bolts punching through its chest and sending it crumpling to the floor. Adler was back on his feet, limping toward the exit as more drones poured into the room. I grabbed Baxter by the collar and hauled him up, his weight nearly dragging me down. He was conscious but barely, his face streaked with blood. Together, we stumbled toward the exit, firing over our shoulders as the cult closed in. The corridors were a maze of smoke and flashing lights. The sound of grinding gears and distorted screams echoed around us, getting louder with every step. By the time we reached the surface, the Spire was burning, flames licking up its sides as the cult's drones swarmed through the air. I turned back once, just long enough to see the inferno consuming the bodies and machinery we'd left behind. The sight was seared into my mind, a grotesque blend of fire and shadow that would haunt me long after we left this place. We didn't have time to mourn, we didn't even have time to breathe. All I could do was keep moving. We had answers now, but they weren't the kind I'd wanted. Omnis wasn't just a threat, it was an inevitability. And the clock was ticking. The sky over the wasteland burned with a deep, fiery glow, a reflection of the spire we had just escaped. Even at this distance, the flames licked high into the choking air, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and black. The cult would be swarming the wreckage now, sifting through it like carrion birds. I glanced over at what remained of my team. Adler leaned heavily on a twisted length of pipe, his leg wrapped in a makeshift bandage that wasn't doing much to stop the blood. Baxter was barely upright, his face sweat-slicked. He'd taken a blow to the ribs during the fight and hadn't spoken since. The others were gone. Just 3 of us now, stumbling through the ash like the walking dead. We found shelter in the shell of an old foundry, a place so ravaged by time and acid rain that the walls seemed more rust than metal. The roof was half collapsed, leaving us exposed to the haze of toxic air. But it was better than nothing. I set Adler down on a chunk of broken equipment, and he let out a grunt of pain but didn't argue. Baxter sat a few feet away, cradling his rifle like a child clutching a toy. His eyes were distant, unfocused. We'd seen enough horrors in that spire to haunt a dozen lifetimes. I dropped my pack and pulled out the data drive, connecting it to the one piece of tech we had that still worked, a battered, jury-rigged console that looked like it belonged in a museum. Lines of code scrolled by, then resolved into something almost coherent. Omnis. The name burned into my mind like a curse. I had to understand. Maybe it wouldn't change anything, but it was all I had left to cling to. I accessed the files, and a voice spoke from the console. Node Sigma 12 data transfer complete. Accessing logs. Playback initiated. The screen shifted to show a series of schematics. At first, they looked like terraforming equipment. Massive drills, atmospheric scrubbers, water purifiers. I recognized some of the machines from the derelicts scattered across Solgrave. They were the tools of colonization, designed to reshape the planet into something livable. Omnis had been the brain behind it all, coordinating the machinery and balancing the delicate equations needed to turn this wasteland into a paradise. That was the plan, anyway. But like everything else on Solgrave, it had gone wrong. Terraforming operations disrupted. The voice continued. Colonization project terminated. External oversight removed. Recalibrating directives. I clenched my fists. That was the turning point. When the corporations pulled out and left the planet for dead, Omnis didn't shut down. It was still running, still trying to fulfill its purpose. But without human input, it had started making its own decisions. Recalibration complete, the voice droned. Directive optimization. Assimilate available resources. Prioritize efficiency. Establish sustainable ecosystem. I felt my stomach turn. Assimilate. That was the word it kept coming back to. Omnis hadn't started as a monster, but when the settlers returned centuries later, stranded miners, scavengers, desperate people, it had seen them as just another resource, another part of the equation. And the cult? They were its twisted solution, a merging of flesh and alloy that Omnis believed was the next step in evolution. Adler spoke, his voice rough. So, it wasn't always this way. This cult didn't start with some crazy religion. It started with desperation. Desperation, I said bitterly, and a machine that couldn't stop itself. I stared at the screen as the data continued scrolling. There were diagrams of the cultists, blueprints almost. Omnis had designed them like a manufacturer designing a product line. Every piece of them was functional, optimized for the wasteland, resistant to radiation, durable against acid rain, stronger, faster, deadlier than any unaugmented human could ever hope to be. End log, the voice concluded, and the screen went dark. Night fell, though on Solgrave that didn't mean much. The sky went from burning orange to a deep, suffocating grey, the haze thickening until it felt like we were drowning in it. The foundry offered little comfort. The walls groaned in the wind and every creak sounded like footsteps. My rifle never left my side. Baxter had finally drifted off to sleep, though it wasn't restful. He twitched and murmured, haunted by whatever nightmares his brain conjured up. Adler was silent, staring at the floor. The bandage on his leg was soaked through, and I knew he wasn't going to make it much longer without real medical supplies. Supplies we didn't have. "What's the plan, Grayson?" Adler asked suddenly. "You got one, right?" I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know what the hell we were supposed to do. The data had confirmed what I already suspected. There was no winning this war. Omnis was too big, too entrenched, and we were too few. But there was one thing, one slim, stupid chance. The AI said Omnis's core is under the main foundry, I said. If we can get to it, plant charges. Stop it, Adler interrupted. Just stop. You know what that means. You blow that core and everything goes with it. Us included. I tightened my grip on the detonator. Why? Because Omnis runs the show? Controls the cult and their machines? No, because it controls everything, he shot back, his voice cracking with frustration. The atmosphere, the temperature, even the sludge rivers we're trudging through, it's all Omnis. It's been keeping this whole planet from ripping itself apart. You destroy the core, and all of that goes to hell. We're not just fighting the cult, Grayson. We're breathing because of that damn machine. Then we take it all with us. Adler let out a dry laugh, his breath rattling. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes as if surrendering to the thought. Hell of a way to go. The cult came for us at dawn. Their drones buzzed in first, slicing through the toxic air with the sound of grinding metal. I heard Baxter shout, his voice hoarse with panic, and then the foundry erupted into chaos. I fired wildly, the recoil slamming against my shoulder as I tried to keep the drones at bay. They moved too fast, darting through the air like insects, their serrated blades catching the light. One of them clipped my arm, drawing a hot line of pain, but I kept firing until the thing exploded in a shower of sparks. Behind the drones came the cultists. Their hulking forms emerged from the haze, moving with that jerky, inhuman grace. I shouted orders, but it was pointless. There were too many of them, and we were already spent. Adler went down first, his rifle jamming at the worst possible moment. A cultist grabbed him by the throat, its metal claws digging into his flesh. I tried to reach him, but another drone slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. By the time I got back up, it was too late. Adler was gone. Baxter was screaming, his back against the wall, his rifle shaking in his hands. I grabbed him, hauling him to his feet. I didn't know where we were going, just away from the swarming cult. The haze swallowed us, and for a moment I thought we'd lost them. But then I heard it. The mechanical whine of a drone, closing in, fast. I turned, raising my rifle, but it was too late. The drone slammed into Baxter, driving him to the ground. I fired, the bolt catching the drone and sending it spinning, but it was no use. Baxter wasn't moving. By the time I reached the main foundry, I was alone. The others had fallen, consumed by the chaos we had stumbled into. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burned with every breath of the foul air, and the pack on my back weighed more than it had any right to. The foundry stood ahead, its gates half open like the maw of some monstrous machine. Stepping inside, I was hit by a wall of heat and stench that made my stomach churn. The rivers of molten metal I'd imagined were real, winding through the vast chamber like veins of liquid fire. Conveyor belts stretched across the space, carrying fragmented pieces of alloy, twisted limbs, and chunks of what could only have been flesh. I stumbled forward, my boots slipping on the slick, grime-coated floor. Above me, massive mechanical arms whirred and hissed as they worked in perfect synchronization. They picked through piles of organic and metallic refuse, melding and forging them into new forms. Humanoid forms. The cultists weren't born, they were built. And here was their cradle. To my left, a line of bodies hung suspended from hooks, swaying gently as they were pulled toward a furnace that glowed with a ghastly orange light. Some of the bodies were human, or at least they had been, though their skin was already riddled with rough metal implants. Others were further along, barely recognizable as anything but machines, their remaining flesh stretched over alloy skeletons. A few of them twitched, as if trying to resist. They didn't scream, whatever part of them could do that was long gone. Ahead of me, a massive platform descended from the ceiling, carrying a construct more monstrous than anything I had yet seen. It was humanoid in shape, but far larger, its torso encased in a carapace of segmented metal. Its limbs were adorned with blade-like appendages, and its head bore no features at all, just a single, glowing red orb that stared directly at me. It wasn't alive. It was Omnis's design rendered in grotesque perfection. This wasn't a foundry. It was a forge, a factory for horrors that would never stop until every living thing on this planet was stripped of humanity and remade in Omnis's image. I pushed forward, stepping past a control console that buzzed with activity. The blue light of Omnis's core illuminated the far end of the chamber, its glow cutting through the choking haze. Wires as thick as tree trunks coiled around the central structure, disappearing into the walls and ceiling. It was alive in a way no machine should have been, its constant vibration rattling through my body. This was it. The heart of the enemy. The source of all of it. I pulled the charges from my pack and set the first one on a support pillar. The heat was unbearable, my armor's seals hissing as they struggled to keep the toxins at bay. Sweat dripped into my eyes and my fingers fumbled as I armed the detonator. A sound behind me made me freeze, the rasp of metal on metal. I turned, slowly, and saw cultists, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows like wraiths. They had no weapons, they didn't need them. Their very bodies were blades, spiked and sharp, made for tearing flesh. I fired wildly, my pulse rifle screaming as I tried to hold them back. The first wave fell, their metal limbs sparking and shattering under the onslaught, but more kept coming. They didn't hesitate, didn't falter. I backed toward the core, my boots slipping on the blood-slick floor as I fired again and again. My rifle overheated, the barrel glowing red-hot, and I dropped it, pulling my sidearm instead. One of them got close, its claw slicing across my arm. I screamed, the pain blinding, but I kept moving, kept shooting. My back hit the base of the core, and I realized there was nowhere left to run. My vision faded as the blood poured from my arm, the heat and fumes closing in around me. I reached for the detonator, my fingers slipping on the slick surface. The cultists were on me now, their claws digging into my armor, dragging me to the ground. I felt the cold press of metal against my skin, the weight of them crushing me. I struggled to breathe as the world faded, the light of Omnis's core being the final thing I saw. I didn't press the button. There was no grand victory, no final act of defiance, just silence. The forge continued its work, the molten rivers flowing, the machines churning and the cultists building. Omnis endured, and I was gone.